My name is Tom Keefe. I'm an assistant professor of humanities at the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. Today's lecture is on Gregory Stanton's stages of genocide and whether they apply to the Native American experience. The question I have is, how does this become this? The first stage of genocide is classification. When we look at American history and the Native American experience, it's clear that Native Americans were classified, legally classified in the Constitution itself. The Constitution in the Commerce Clause differentiates between nation-states, states, and the Native Americans, therefore saying that they are neither foreign countries nor are they domestic equal states. Furthermore, later in one of his decisions, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Native Americans and their tribal governments were like wards to a guardian. So clearly, stage one classification has been met. The second stage of genocide is symbolization. Symbolization might be visual, or it might be words, and how language is used to dehumanize and denigrate people. Here in the United States, we have a national Native American glossary, it seems to me. Idiomatic expressions like Mohawk, ticket scalping, Indian giver, and so forth. We have terms to dehumanize individuals and people, savages, redskins, squaw, as well as other more pejorative and dangerous words and languages, as well as other terms for people and individuals that dehumanize, denigrate people, calling Native Americans savages, redskins, squaws, warriors, to assume that Native American women are sexual objects and that Native American men are merely warriors prone to being violent. The third stage is discrimination. Not all discrimination leads to genocide. However, according to Gregory Stanton and these stages that he put forth to better understand the concept of genocide, again, I'd point back to the Constitution of the United States and the decisions by the Supreme Court of the United States. Legal discrimination, legal separation of people from other people. The denial of rights that are afforded to other people, to other citizens. We are very proud in the United States of our First Amendment rights. However, the freedom of religion was not afforded to Native Americans. In fact, the opposite. The U.S. government legally discriminated against Native American religion, specifically banning the ghost dance. And in 1924, let me check that. It was not until 1924 that Native Americans were afforded affirmative citizenship. What I mean by that is that prior to 1924, yes, there were Native Americans who were U.S. citizens, but it was not assumed that all Native Americans were U.S. citizens. Again, not until 1924 and the passage of the Snyder Act did Native Americans receive affirmed citizenship, while even the 14th Amendment in the Civil War Amendments series afforded and affirmed citizenship to any natural-born person in the United States, and yet that excluded Native Americans. The fourth stage of genocide is dehumanization. How have Native Americans been dehumanized? This is perhaps the strongest argument to be made in the case that the Native American experience is and does meet the definition of genocide. The following pictures are offensive. I understand they're offensive. But this is the Native American experience. There seems to be a double standard for offensive pictures that portray Native Americans versus other populations within the United States. It seems to me that we would be horrified if any of these pictures or nicknames were used to describe sports franchises in the United States. These are offensive. If these are offensive, why do we not hold the same standard for the offensive visual and linguistical portrayal of Native Americans? I said earlier, it seems to me we have an over-sexualized, hyper-sexualized view of Native American women. Just look at the aisles of costumes towards Halloween season. Look at sports mascots. Look at how men are portrayed, always as violent. The appropriation and the misappropriation of tribal clothing, terminology, weapons, headdresses, habitats, modes of transportation. The argument has always been made that somehow these sports mascots and franchises are honoring Native Americans. It does not seem to be honoring when you have language that dehumanizes, as well as adjectives that hyper describe women as sexual and men as violent. The NCAA, of course, years ago, banned 14 teams because of the usage of violent and implied violence in their names. The Fighting Illini, the Fighting Sioux, etc. In the United States, thankfully, we've gotten to the point where we understand it is inappropriate to use the N-word in any level of public discourse. I don't understand, and it seems a double standard to me, that the R word is used with such ease in our culture at the same time that the N word, thankfully, has become taboo. In fact, some Native American journalists and historians have suggested that rhetorically it seems strange that somehow non-Native Americans objectively feel comfortable with treating Native Americans different than any other subpopulation of Americans. It does not seem like honoring when you're stereotyping. The fifth stage of genocide is known as the organizational stage of genocide. When we discuss organization, what we're talking about is non-state actors. And the idea that somehow European Americans felt comfortable committing acts of violence against Native Americans without fear of legal consequence. That's the important point here, that people acted violently towards Native Americans knowing that they would not be held to those crimes. Think of it conversely. If Native Americans had attacked European Americans, would they have been immune to prosecution? The next several slides are just a list of some of the massacres perpetuated by European Americans against Native Americans. And all of these are ununiformed. The Great Swamp Massacre in Rhode Island, the Colorado River Massacre, just to name some of the particularly gruesome ones. And I think most of us here in Colorado are aware of the Sand Creek Massacre and finally the Wounded Knee Massacre. These are all massacres perpetuated against Native Americans without fear of recrimination. In stage 6, polarization, what we see is the usage of language to divide populations. In this country, we seem to have an unequal, non-holistic view of some of our founding fathers. Our founding fathers have been put on a pedestal, rightfully so for what they have done well, but I'm not sure that most people in their educational careers learn some of these other quotes by our founding fathers. George Washington, who said, "Indians and wolves are both beasts of prey, though they differ in shape." Thomas Jefferson said, "If we ever are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated." That's the third and previously the first president of the United States talking about dehumanization and murder of Native American populations. The media, a powerful tool historically as well as currently. The Rocky Mountain News, which advocated the extermination of, quote, "the dissolute, vagabondish, brutal, and ungrateful race." Legal polarization, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which prohibited, yes, it prohibited relationships between European Americans and Sub-Saharan African Americans, but it was also used to prevent interracial marriages between Native Americans and European Americans as well. And the fact that Native Americans were taken from their families, sent to these Indian boarding schools, And even as recently as 2013, and let me be clear, I understand that the intent of the Supreme Court in 2013, but what other population of Americans would be given legal status to object to adoption? In 2013, adoptive couple versus baby girl, that's a case in which a woman gave up parental rights to her child. The baby was put up for adoption, and because the father was an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, the baby was taken away from its adoptive parents and returned to the tribe. Again, I understand the intent of that decision, but would that decision be made in reference to any other subcultural, subnational, subracial, or subethnic group? I don't think so. This is polarization. The Daily Republican in Winona, Minnesota, which advertised the reward, had increased to $200 for the turning in of dead Indians. The Atchison Daily Champion in Kansas, which talked about, quote, hunt for redskins with a view of obtaining their scalps, for $250. The usage of media, legislation, and other forms of political rhetoric to divide people is an example of the stage of polarization. Frank Baum, the beloved author of The Wizard of Oz, before becoming a celebrated author, had been an editor of a Midwestern newspaper in which he wrote, quote, better that they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. The Wizard of Oz is talking about the death of Native Americans and presuming that they are miserable wretches because they're Native American. This is polarizing language used to dehumanize and discriminate. We know that hate speech is illegal. It's been so ruled in 2003 in the famous case Black versus Virginia. However, again, hate speech has been used against Native Americans for decades and even centuries. Another quote from the Rocky Mountain News from August 10th, 1864, quote, a few months of active extermination against the Red Devils will bring quiet and nothing else will. Nothing else will but the murder of Native Americans. In stage 7, we enter the preparation phase of genocide. In this stage, non-state actors and increasingly state actors act out violently. Already I showed you the list of massacres, but at this stage, the preparation stage, we are getting closer to the extermination stage of genocide. Here in Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre, orchestrated by the Reverend John Chivington, who used to say, nits make lice. That is, in order to get rid of Native Americans, you have to get rid of Native American children. And so he did. And so he tried. And so he was successful down southeast at the Sand Creek Massacre. General Philip Sheridan is the celebrated hero of the Civil War, who in his lifetime was the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. He said that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. General Nelson Miles, who in his lifetime was also the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. He wrote a book entitled The Indian Problem. My point is if military and political and media leaders are saying these things, what is that doing to the civilian population who are hearing these things? Richard Henry Pratt, the father of the Indian boarding schools, who said that we need to kill the Indian in him in order to save the man. And these Indian boarding schools, what did they do? It was forced assimilation. Forced assimilation. The famous biography of Dr. Charles Eastman, his hair was forcibly cut. He was forced to wear Western clothing. He was punished for speaking his indigenous family language. He was forced to convert to Christianity, and he was forced to do industrial work while at the Indian boarding schools. And his case, of course, is not unique. This was done to hundreds and thousands of Native Americans, usually Native American males, boys, the children of tribal leaders, essentially a form of hostage taking, that the children of the tribal leaders were taken. We know that the Nazis cut the beards of Jewish men. The Indian boarding schools cut the hair of Native boys and men. The Nazis forced the Roma to wear Western clothing, just as the Indian boarding schools forced Native children to wear Western clothing. In Turkey, they banned the Armenian language, and here in the United States, essentially the Native American languages were banned. Certainly in the Indian boarding schools they were. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge forcibly converted people to atheism. And in the United States, in the Indian boarding schools and on the reservations, Native Americans were forced to adopt Christianity. And as we all know, the Nazis had work camps and death camps. And here in the United States, we had industrial schools with forced labor, uncompensated labor. And these are decades after slavery was banned in the United States. In fact, if you look at the Indian boarding schools, what you'll notice is that the Indian boarding schools are primarily outside of tribal lands. What is the purpose of removing the children of tribal leaders from their families and transporting them outside of tribal territories? The United Nations legal definition of genocide talks about the forcible transfer of populations, and specifically the transfer of children from their native population centers. Take a look at this map. These Native American Indian boarding schools are outside of the unorganized territories of the United States. This is forcible transfer of populations outside of indigenous areas, which is a form of genocide under the United Nations legal definition. Stage 8, persecution. The reservation system itself, the seizure of Native American property, the forced transfer to reservations, which interestingly enough used to be administered underneath the Department of War before being transferred to the Department of Interior. The forced sale of Native American property under the Dawes Act. In stage 8, we also have a corollary here where the intellectual class, the leadership, is removed in preparation for genocide. We discussed already the Indian boarding schools and how the inmates of these boarding schools were primarily the children of the leaders of the tribal communities. We've talked about the forcible transfer of these children to the schools, which were outside of the tribal territories, outside of the unorganized territories of the United States. But we also have this shell game of taking Lakota people and imprisoning them in Florida, taking Seminole leaders from Florida and imprisoning them in South Carolina, taking Native Americans from Texas and imprisoning them in Alabama and Florida. This shuffling of people around in order to prevent contact between leaders and their people. And finally, stage 9, extermination. Early in our history of America, before the establishment even of the United States government, the Pequot War, where Native Americans were militarily defeated and enslaved and deported to Bermuda. The well-known Cherokee Trail of Tears, but there are other trails of tears. The 5 so-called civilized nations, all deported out of the Southeast and forced across the Mississippi, all meeting the UN definition of genocide. The Mankato hangings, the largest mass execution in American history, so recently that we have photographs of it, including the execution of Little Six at Medicine Bottle. The Indian Wars. Earlier we talked about non-state actors perpetuating massacres against Native Americans. What about the massacres by uniformed US soldiers? Page after page of battles. Battles if the violence was being perpetuated by the European Americans, massacres if they're being perpetuated by the Native Americans. I think we need to just check the language there that's being used to discriminate against Native Americans in and of itself. From 1823 to 1918, my grandfather was alive in 1918. Centuries of violence, and just recently. So again, I ask you, These acts of violence, are they offense? Are they defense? Most of them occurred within the unorganized territories. Take a look at this map. We have the unorganized territories, and in this map we have identifications of where the massacres and battles occurred. It's not a coincidence. These battles and massacres were perpetuated in Native American lands in order to eliminate Native Americans. It was not necessity, it was aggression. And finally, stage 10, the denial. How many of us were taught that the Native American experience was genocide? How many of us grew up playing cowboys and Indians? Would we tolerate playing a game called Germans and Jews? Would we tolerate playing a game called Turks and Armenians or Hutus and Tutsis? And yet, many of us grew up playing cowboys and Indians. There's an acceptance of the violence, an acceptance of the genocide. And in fact, in these games of cowboys and Indians, there's cultural appropriation and misappropriation. The combination of Northwest Pacific Native American totem poles, at the same time that we have Plains tribal clothing and settlers working westward across those plains. This insensitivity is part of the denial of the genocide that occurred. Denial is a perpetuation of selective history, ignoring the human faces of the Trail of Tears, ignoring the language of genocide by the founding fathers who called Indians and wolves both beasts of prey. The founding fathers who said that if we ever raise the hatchet, we shall never lay it down until we exterminate. History is about which story we tell, and my argument would be that we've chosen to tell an incomplete story. Denial is not just the inability to apologize or admit to a wrong, it's the manipulation of history. Former U.S. Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas suggested that the United States should have a formal document in which, quote, we thanked Native Americans for the assistance provided by Native Americans, and yet also take accountability for the killing of Indian women and children, the Trail of Tears, the Long Walk, the Sand Creek Massacre, Wounded Knee, the theft of tribal lands and resources, the breaking of treaties, and the removal of Indian children to boarding schools. This is what Sam Brownback apologized. He proposed it. It was rejected. He proposed it. It was rejected. He proposed it. Interestingly enough, he finally got it into legislation by inserting it into a defense spending bill. However, the language was changed, and the final resolution carried none of the specifics, but did apologize on behalf of the United States to all Native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect of Native peoples by citizens of the United States, and urges the United States President to acknowledge the wrongs of the United States against Indian tribes in the history of the United States in order to bring healing to this land. That's the final apology. No public signing ceremony, no Oval Office address, but at least there is, and has been now, an apology. Now, having said that, there are counter-arguments to my presentation. First of all, when we look at other famous genocides, there's usually a single person or persons that are held responsible. Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, Hitler and Himmler in Germany, leader number one in Cambodia, etc., etc. There is not a single person who perpetuated the Native American genocide. The Native American genocide was perpetuated by all of us, by presidents, by military leaders, by the media, and by average citizens. The other counter-argument is time itself. When we look at the German genocide, we know it starts with Kristallnacht and ends in 1945. We know that the Tutsi genocide occurred in 1994. We know that the Cambodian genocide happened in the 1970s. What is the time constraint to the Native American genocide? Does it begin with Columbus? Has it ended? Is it still going on? When we look at the high rates of suicide, diabetes, depression, unemployment, education, access to health services, and so forth, still existing today on Native American lands. However, it seems to me that there still is a pattern of genocide regardless of those counter-arguments. There is a pattern of terra nullius, the idea of that the Native Americans were not human and did not own the land, and therefore the European settlers were right to take it without compensation. The pattern of genocide of the forcible transfer of populations, the pattern of genocide of banning indigenous religions, the pattern of genocide of assigning children and transferring them to Indian boarding schools, the usage of language like massacres rather than battles to describe the conflict between Europeans and Native Americans, and even the identification and usage of disease as a tool of war against Native Americans. Sir Jeffrey Amherst, who famously said that we should collect blankets of smallpox and disseminate them to Native Americans. By today's standards, that's biological warfare. That's the history of the Native American experience and genocide. No, the Native American genocide might not be linear like other genocides. It might be cyclical or conical, but it was inevitable. Thank you.